Dr. Lennox, before we speak about more, I suppose, profound or philosophical issues, you heard C.S. Lewis in 1962, and I'm always reluctant to ask people who knew him what was he like, because it seems unfair. You're trying to use that person vicariously, but he's my great hero. He died in 63. These were his final lectures at Cambridge, I assume.
They were, in the English faculty, which was just across Mill Lane from the Maths Institute. So I used to nip in, not realizing, of course, that he was terminally ill. And the abiding impression is that in the cold winter that it was, he would come crashing in through the double doors. He was a big burly chap, possibly slightly bigger than me. And the room was full, people sitting in the windows, breaking all the non-existent health and safety regulations of the time, on the floor, just leaving a little path. But what he'd do, he'd start lecturing the moment he opened the door. And then he would slowly divest himself of his hat and his scarf and his coat. So by the time he stood at the lectern, you'd already had 5 minutes of a word-perfect, brilliant lecture. The fun was that he ended the lecture in the reverse way. He kept lecturing while he put on his hat, wound up his scarf, put on his coat as he was walking out, and the last words were delivered as he burst through the double doors. There was no Q&A. and I could still see that. It was wonderful.
Oh, what a wonderful thing to experience. And it was on John Donne.
It was in John Donne. And like you, Lewis has had a very profound influence on me. He wasn't a scientist, but he understood geometry and he had a phenomenal imagination. But what he did understand was the philosophy of science in a way that I find rare in a scientist. And in that sense, he was prescient about many of the things he wrote about in the 1940s and 50s that are now huge topics of conversation.
Well, his science fiction trilogy really predicts what we are facing now, I think.
Oh, it does indeed. It's marvelous.
Now let's talk about science.
Yes, sure.
Probably this doesn't happen to you, you're above this, but when I speak sometimes, often somebody will say, what about Galileo?
Yes.
And I always say, spell his name. They never can. But because
I've never tried that.
It was the only one, of course, they can think of where they believe they have an argument that the church, the Catholic Church at the time, persecuted him. They don't really know what was going on, and in fact, he was part of the Christian community. But I think that science and Christianity have been so mingled. We think of and by the way, Copernicus, of course, was a priest. But we think of
as was Georges Lemaitre.
Exactly, and so many of the people who have advanced in terms of DNA and our scientific knowledge have been deeply religious people. There is no contradiction between science and the Christian faith.
Well, reverting to Galileo, that kind of iconic falsification is due simply not to knowing history, because the first people that attacked Galileo were not the Catholic Church, but actually the contemporary philosophers. And the reason for that was that they were Aristotelians who had believed for centuries that the earth didn't move. Now, of course, the Catholic Church, along with everybody else, had jumped on that particular bandwagon. The irony of it all is that what Galileo was doing was challenging the reigning worldview, the reigning paradigm, and he believed in God before he started, and he believed in God when he finished. And serious historians of science will not use any of these stories. And Colin Russell, who's was the professor of the history of science at the Open University, says the thing that needs to be explained is how these stories came to be used at all to perpetuate what's now called the conflict myth, that there's an essential warfare between science and religion. I think it's very important to realize that there isn't. And as you say, Christians have contributed to science. The way I'd put it in the contemporary world is to say, look, the Nobel Prize for Physics was won a couple of years ago by Peter Higgs, who's a Scotsman and an atheist. A few years before that, it was won by Bill Phillips in the States, who's a Christian. What separates them is not their science. They both won the Nobel Prize for Physics, after all. What separates them is their worldview. And the real conflict is between the worldview of atheism on the one side and, in my case, of Christian theism on the other. There are brilliant scientists on both sides of that. So the real question is not, are science and religion in conflict, but what way does science point? Does it sit most comfortably with atheism, as Dawkins would suggest, or does it sit most comfortably with theism, as I would suggest?
How would you justify then your proposition?
Well, number one is history, of course. That starting with Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on, the greats were believers in God, and historians of science have really come to the fairly well-agreed conclusion. I mean, you have to nuance it, but Lewis put it, as usual, as best as anybody, when he said men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. Right. In other words, far from belief in God hindering science, it was the motive that drove it. And sometimes I put that very forcibly by saying, you know, I'm not remotely embarrassed at being a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I think it's worse in North America than it is in Europe.
Could be.
There's been a retreat from what people falsely perhaps see as modernism, and so anything that seems to advance the culture is looked on with a certain suspicion. Often, though, it comes down to the issue of intelligent design, creation, evolution. People use these terms often without understanding. But is there a set Christian, intelligent, informed Christian position on creation?
Well, I think there is, but I have tried to respond to that actual situation as you described it by writing a book on it called 7 Days That Divide the World, because it seems to me a lot of the tension is simply misplaced. And I would want to argue, to cut a very long story short, that the fascinating thing is the concurrence at the moment between the standard model, the idea that space-time had a beginning, and in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. We forget what happened historically, because, as you said, I was in Cambridge in the 1960s, and not only was Lewis still there, but this was the time when evidence began to come in that there was a beginning to space-time.
Right.
And it was resisted by the British scientific establishment. Notably, in a famous editorial in Nature, written by John Maddox, who was the then editor, who said something like, we mustn't go down this route of having a beginning and using science to support it, because it'll give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible.
Yes.
And here the irony was that it's reminiscent of Galileo, but it's one of the major advances in cosmology in the 20th century was being resisted because it was too closely parallel to the Bible.
And it was so anti-intellectual too, because he wasn't saying we must resist it because it's not true. We must resist it because it will give our enemies too much ammunition.
Oh, that's right. Truth gets sacrificed, and that is a very perceptive and important point to make. The question is it true? And the current state of science is that there's a finite backwards in time. There's a beginning. Yeah. However you understand all these complexities that people talk about. And I was asked at a very famous laboratory not long ago, at a meeting, which was a private meeting of 50 scientists, theologians, and so on, can we find a common language? And I was interrupted by the physicist who said, now, Professor Lennox, you're not seriously meaning to suggest that the Bible can contribute anything to us physicists in the 21st century. Oh, I said, I am. You've understood me perfectly. I said, think about it. The Bible, of course, is pre-scientific in the technical sense, but it has a worldview that starts with, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which is a comment on the physical universe which you study. Now, let me suggest this to you. If you hadn't been so blinded by Aristotle and the perpetual eternal universe and taken seriously the biblical worldview, you might just have looked for evidence of a beginning before you did. Because you can make a prediction based on the biblical worldview. You can make the prediction that, well, there may have been a beginning. And there was a sort of wry response to that, but at least they conceded it.
What has always struck me with your work and in this interview, you're speaking to the Christian world as much as to the non-Christian world.
Oh, absolutely, yes, absolutely. Because I see two tasks. One is to get into the public space, a rational alternative to atheism or whatever. The second is to encourage the Christian public that if they take their base documents seriously, they can have a lot more confidence in them.
Yeah.
But we need to take them seriously. The big difficulty I see is that what I call the two speeds of education. Professional education going up like this, sort of Christian education remaining at a kind of Sunday school level, so that the minute people open their mouths, where they're up here professionally and down there, their colleagues just see the mismatch.
Yeah.
And of course that silences them. And what I want to do is to say we must do God in public.
Yes, we must do God in public. What a wonderful way to end this interview. A real pleasure, a privilege. Thank you so very much.
Mine too, thank you.